Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Amber Nightingale Sultani, the Associate State Director for Community Outreach with AARP here in Northern Virginia. And I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us today. AARP Virginia is thrilled to continue our collaboration with the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University. This collaboration allows us an opportunity to bring our members a sampling of the rich programs that is offered each semester by Ali Mason. From our earliest beginnings, AARP has been a champion of lifelong learning. Our founder, Dr. Ethel Percy Andrews, once said, "The eagerness to learn, to pioneer in the development of new skills and new abilities, to broaden the personal scopes of understanding, to freshen the mind with new ideas and new concepts, to achieve new heights of knowledge, has no age restriction." Those words are as true today as when she spoke them in the 1950s. Studies have shown that challenging your brain in new ways throughout your life may strengthen your brain. Our brain is stimulated and makes new connections when we learn new things or pursue new interests. So AARP encourages you to stay curious and give yourself a good mental workout by doing something that challenges your thinking, offers you enjoyment, and encourages you to grapple with new and complex ideas. And I hope today's lecture will do that for you and more. Thank you again for joining us.
Greetings and warm welcome from Ali Mason. The Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at George Mason University has been in existence for over 30 years. We offer lectures, clubs, special events, and trips, as well as many volunteer opportunities such as teaching and service on committees. There are many things you can learn and do at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. We're very happy to be collaborating today with AARP, and I want to welcome all of our OLLI members, as well as those of you who are coming in from Virginia and across the United States. We're very happy that you've joined us today, and we hope that you will look at our website to learn more about OLLI at olli.gmu.edu. Please enjoy today's presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer and Amber. Welcome. This is Class 1 of 4 of the American West with our speaker, Richard Stillson. Richard has a PhD in economics from Stanford University. After a 25-year career at the International Monetary Fund, he retired to indulge his passion for history. He earned his PhD in history from Johns Hopkins University and has taught history as an adjunct professor at George Mason University. Stillson is the author of Spreading the News, A History of Information in the California Gold Rush. Richard, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I would like to say sorry again for last week. Technical problems do happen, but now I think we're all straight. I hope that everyone received my written apology from last week, but also my little welcome note and reading list. The reading list is hardly required reading, but I thought it was useful for people who wanted to dig a little bit deeper in some aspects of American Western history. The lectures and the slides are self-contained. Also, I will send to everyone the slides after each presentation. So there's no need to take any notes. But before we start, why don't we consider for a moment why to study the West as a region and also particularly Western history? One answer is the incredible impact that US Western history, particularly in the 19th century, has had on our collective imaginations. For instance, is everybody getting?
You need to share your slides.
Uh-huh.
Screen share, green button.
Share screen. Share. Okay.
And turn on your PowerPoint. There you
Can everybody see that now?
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
Okay. Well, where were we? We were looking at the effect that the American West has had on our collective imaginations. Of course, there were cowboys and Indians. Did anybody growing up, say, in the 50s or 60s, play cowboys and Indians as a child? I certainly did. And you know something? It wasn't just in the US. An English writer named David Lusted, he wrote, talking about growing up in London in the 50s, playing cowboys and Indians was a regular feature of my childhood. The street was a prairie, sticks and fingers were guns and bows. He wrote that the individual and collective imagination, now this is England, was fed by Westerns on the screens and cinemas of television sets. Philip Loy, another Western historian, wrote, Westerns were significant in the socialization process of youngsters and adults in the middle quarter of the 20th century. Westerns reflected, reinforced, and helped to shape values, attitudes, and behavior patterns. Wow, that's a mouthful. Roy Rogers as a social influencer, to use a trendy term. Well, perhaps so. And you know, it wasn't just in the US and England. Playing right now in Germany, Pullman City, a Western themed theme park. There were 1 million people who came to this park in 2020, before the COVID. As you can see, there seem to be a lot of people who like to see things that give an idea of the 19th century West in the United States, not just in Germany. Here we have Wild West City. That's in the Czech Republic. There's also a No Chance City south of Vienna. So you can see the 19th century Western US has really captured the imaginations of people throughout the world, and still do, because these theme parks are still going and still attracting large attendance. Well, if we decide that we want to study something about this Western history, how are we going to do it? Here's the course. It's 4 weeks, and of course, we are a week late. Today, we're going to start exploring Western US geography. We're going to take a trip around the West. It's important because geography is crucial to almost any study of history, but in Western US, geography matters a great deal. We're also going to talk a little bit about the natural history and the climate of the West, and we're going to look at some early Indian history. And we'll focus on the Plains Indians and in particular, the Cheyenne tribe. Next week, the Americans come. That's the famous thing that theme parks are all about. And we'll take a look at the documented history of the 19th century, maybe a little bit different than what we look at in the third week, the mythological history, mainly books, novels, and movies. But we'll see there are also theme parks and many ways in which the 19th century West has affected our culture. Finally, the last week, which is now February 22nd, we'll look at the more modern West, the 20th century. And I may even have a few things to say about the 21st century. So our trip. If we're going to have a trip, we need a map. And if any of you have been in some of my previous courses, you know I do love maps. And this is a good map for looking at the effect of the terrain on Western history. It's a USGS topo that I've centered on the West. You can see that we have the Great Plains, and if you're going east to west, particularly in a covered wagon, you hit up at the top the Tetons and the Bitterroot Mountains, and then the Rockies, what's called the Front Range, right at the eastern side, and then down into the Southern Rockies. Those mountains to the pioneers and the gold rushers were a wall, a very formidable wall. The mountain men could get around all right, but they didn't have covered wagons. If you came in a covered wagon, that wall was impassable. But you know something? There's a door in that wall, a door called South Pass. It's right about there. And we'll show that. But if you can go through the door and get west into the mountains, it is really rugged. We have the whole Rocky Mountains to get through. But fortunately, if you go through the door, there are trails and ways to get down to Salt Lake. And then across this area in Nevada, which is called the Great Basin. We'll talk about the Great Basin. It plays a big role. But even if you get across that, look, there is another wall. That's the Cascades in the north and the Sierra Nevada along the eastern part of California, of what is now California. Two walls, a difficult trip. Finally, you can get to the coast and the big Central Valley of California. Now, around the sides, there are a bunch of deserts, and we're going to take a look at those as well. Okay, that is basically our trip. We are not going to look at the cities. This is about the terrain and how it affects the history. And unfortunately, we're not going to look much at Texas. Texas is so big, it's got a dozen ecological zones all by itself. And its own history, which is part of Western history, but it's also part of Southern history, is a topic for a course all by itself. So we're not going to talk too much about that. Well, if we're going to take this trip around the West, we better figure out where the West begins. The northern border of the West is obvious. That's the Canadian border. The western border is obvious. That's the Pacific Ocean. The southern border is obvious. That's the Mexican border. But where's the eastern border? Where does the West begin if you're traveling east to west? Well, it turns out that on the Great Plains of the US, if you drew a north-south line kind of straight through the middle of the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, and cut off the panhandle of Oklahoma, the climate is very different to the east of that line than to the west. It is much drier to the western Great Plains than the eastern Great Plains. And historians and geographers have kind of decided, maybe a little arbitrarily, that they're going to put the east border along the 98th meridian. That cuts right through the middle of the Great Plains states. So there you have it. We now know where the West is. Okay, let's start our trip. We're going to start
Richard?
up in the north.
Richard,
Yes?
are you trying to use a pointer when you're talking about these things?
Yes.
Because it's not showing up. You have to enable your pointer on PowerPoint. Do you know how to do that?
I don't know.
You don't know.
Let's see. Here's PowerPoint.
Yeah.
If I click,
There should be a utility bar, and it should allow you to, okay, you clicked out of it.
da-da-da-da-dum.
Down at the bottom, you should be able to find a utility bar in PowerPoint that allows you
We
to
can
open
see his
your,
pointer now, Meg.
you can see his pointer now?
Yeah, it's small, but it's not, the red dot.
Okay, that, hopefully people can follow that.
Okay, that's good. I didn't click on anything. I don't see this utility bar.
Okay, your mouse is now showing up.
Yay. Okay.
Yay.
I find economics and history a lot easier than computer technology. Oops. There we go. Okay, we're starting up in the northern plains. There's going to be a lot of photographs, and I've taken almost all of them, so please forgive the amateur photography, but I think they get the idea across. Certainly on this one, take a look. Grasses, very important grasses and flat. This is the best pasture land for buffalo, for instance, but also horses that you can imagine. And it was used that way, and it becomes a very important aspect of the ecology affecting the history. Well, from here, let's go south a bit. If you go south of Montana, you get into a much drier area. I took this in, I think, roughly July. The sagebrush was really blooming. Sagebrush rules the prairie. It's an amazing plant, grows where nothing else grows, and you can really smell it when you're out on the prairie. On the western prairie, it's dry and sagebrush rules. Eastern prairie, no, there the grasses are, and of course now they're growing winter wheat and corn and soybeans. Okay, we're going south. We've seen the effect of the dry western plains. Okay, let's head west and take a look at our wall. This is the Grand Tetons. I took this picture to emphasize the idea of the wall. Notice there's no foothills. You're on the flat prairie, and all of a sudden, bang, there's this incredible mountain and a chain of mountains. By the way, it's a national park just south of Yellowstone. And if you're making a trip to Yellowstone or a trip to the west, I strongly recommend going to Grand Teton. It is fantastic. And if you like to hike, there are many, many trails of different degrees of difficulty. The Grand Tetons, the northern part of the wall. But I said there was a door in the wall. It's called South Pass. And in some of the letters and diaries of gold rushers, I read they were actually disappointed. They had heard so much of the Great Wall, and here was this easy trail over the Continental Divide, and it just seemed too easy. Well, those guys quickly learned that it became much more difficult as it went west. Okay, there's the door. To the right of what that picture is, you're looking at the Grand Tetons. To the left, south, you're looking at the Rocky Mountains. The Rocky Mountains. This is farther south. It's relatively dry and very formidable. You don't get a covered wagon over that mountain. It's called the Front Range because that's the first thing that the pioneers saw going east to west. If you go a little farther south, you can see the Rocky Mountains in full. This picture was taken in the Rocky Mountain National Park. I don't know, there are a dozen peaks over 11,000 feet. The Rocky Mountains are very formidable. By the way, the Rocky Mountain National Park is another wonderful place to vacation, and particularly if you like to hike like I do. There are trails of different degrees of difficulty. I actually got up to one of the smaller mountains, but there are also some that are very difficult if you like rock climbing. Okay, the southern part of the wall. So we've explored the wall. Now we're going to go south and into New Mexico. We're going to cut across New Mexico and we get to Chaco Canyon. Now, Chaco Canyon is in the middle of a high desert. This is the first desert we're going to visit. It is a canyon. You can see there are walls, but though the canyon isn't so impressive as a canyon, but it is extraordinarily impressive because of this. In Chaco Canyon, there are incredible ruins so large that they might actually be compared to the Mayan ruins farther south. What on earth are these things doing in the middle of nowhere? It's a mystery, or was a mystery for 150 years of archaeological work. It's the work of the ancient Pueblo Indians. They used to be called the Anasazi. You might have heard that word before. It's a Navajo word, and it's very derogatory. So the modern Pueblos had said, hey, I don't want to be called the Anasazi. And so historians and archaeologists have kind of agreed. And we now just say the ancient Pueblos. It was a huge culture and organization. Archaeologists are still trying to figure out just how it worked, because it's not only in Chaco Canyon. There are other great houses around the high desert, and even up in Colorado. Perhaps some of you have been to Mesa Verde. It's the same ancient Pueblos who built Mesa Verde. Now the mystery deepens because around the last quarter of the 13th century, they abandoned it. Consider the amount of work. It took 100 years to build Cliff House and the town around it. And within 20 years, they just left. And all they left was the ruin. Why? What happened? A lot of that archaeological work has gone into trying to answer that question. I find it fascinating, and so I did a deeper dive into this, and now I have another course on the ancient Pueblos, and I think I'm giving it in May. So if you want to learn more, you can take that course. But anyway, you can see it is still desert. Well, let's go farther south, another desert, the Sonoran Desert. Now, these pictures were taken just west of Tucson in a kind of state park that showed the different kinds of life forms in the Sonoran Desert. The saguaro cacti, which can be very impressive. And then there's the cholla. These cacti, by the way, on the right-hand picture, you have to be careful of those things. They bite. Actually, they are capable of kind of throwing their needles out at something that gets too close. Never happened to me because I was warned, but I knew some people who got stuck with the cholla needles, and apparently it's not at all pleasant. So, yet another ecology, the Sonoran Desert. We've had quite a few ecologies so far: the Western Great Plains, the mountains, the Rockies, the high desert in New Mexico. Now, this is much farther south, right in the southern part of Arizona. Well, what happens if you go north? Well, you hit the Grand Canyon, but we're going to skip that. Everybody knows the Grand Canyon. But do you know Monument Valley? John Ford country. Raise your hand if you know who John Ford is. When I say that in undergraduate classes, the students, except for a few who are kind of film buffs, are completely befuddled. Who's the John Ford? And then I said, what about John Wayne? And a few more have heard of John Wayne. But it's an incredible place. And can't you just see the stagecoach rushing down that valley, and followed by yelling Indians, followed by the cavalry who have to come and save everybody in the last frame of the movie. Well, it wasn't really like that, as we'll see next week, but the scenery is just as John Ford photographed it. It's amazing. Okay, well, let's now keep our trip. We're going to go up to the western side of the Rocky Mountains, and we're going to go all the way up to the Pacific Northwest. There's the map again. I don't know can you see my cursor?
Actually, if I can get you to hit Control L, your laser pointer will enable.
Control L. I just hit Control L. Did that?
And try moving your cursor. I don't see it.
There, I am moving it. Well,
Okay.
just have to describe
I
it.
think he has to be in presentation mode for that to work.
He is in presentation mode.
Thought it was. Anyway, we've come down the eastern side of the Rockies, along the Front Range, then to New Mexico and the Chaco Canyon area. It's right there, but you can't see my pointer. It's in the northwest corner of New Mexico. And then we went straight south to the southern Arizona, the Sonoran Desert. And now we're going to go up the western side of the Rockies all the way up to the Pacific Northwest. So sorry about the pointer, but you can follow the map. Pacific Northwest. This is Eastern Washington, a completely different ecology. Again, we keep running into different terrain, different ecology, and that all affected the history. The Palouse Hills is wonderful winter wheat country, except it's very, very hilly. It's these rolling hills. If you're going to farm winter wheat in the Palouse country, you got to know how to do it on a hill. Well, and I have another reason for going up to Eastern Washington. I couldn't avoid it. My undergraduate alma mater, WASU, Washington State University. Hey, go Cougs. Okay, enough of that. Let's cross the state of Washington. And what do we hit? The second wall, Cascades. They are just as formidable as the Rockies, and there is no door. The only way that people could get there with covered wagons is to abandon the covered wagons or put them on boats that go up the Snake River Valley and then to the Columbia and take the Columbia through. But that is a really rough trip. In the Cascades is Mount Rainier. I hope all of you have been to Seattle and seen Mount Rainier in the distance. It's an amazing mountain and another national park. Actually, I worked there for one summer when I was an undergraduate, managing a gas station in a place called Longmire, which is in the lower reaches of the park. Anyway, the second wall. If we go further south, the wall gets even bigger. The Sierra Nevada, the most incredible alpine mountains in the US, in my opinion. Grander than the Rockies, for instance. You don't get a covered wagon over that. And if you go a little farther south in the Sierras, what do you hit? You can't visit the Sierras without visiting Yosemite. An incredible place. Probably a lot of you have seen Yosemite. This is from the valley looking up at Half Dome. But if you go to Yosemite, don't stay down in the valley where all the people are. Get up to the high country. The Yosemite National Park has wonderful trails up in the high country. This is taken from Glacier Point and showing Sierra Nevada Falls. By the way, there's actually a trail that goes up Nevada Falls, goes up through Sierra Falls, and goes to the base of Half Dome, the back of it. I've taken that trail, but I certainly did not try to go up Half Dome. It's a doable hike for somebody who is reasonably fit, but not a mountain climber. Okay, Yosemite. Now, we said that we would talk about the Great Basin a bit. Okay, Great Basin is to the east of Yosemite, and another mystery, a puzzle that absolutely befuddled geographers for a long time. The basin drains the western side of the Rockies and the eastern side of the Sierras. There's a lot of snowmelt and water that comes down. Some of it drained through what's called the Humboldt River. And you can see a picture of that. At times, there's a lot of water in the Humboldt. Other times, it's pretty dry. It is actually a desert. There's very little rainfall. There's a lot of water that runs through it, but not a lot of water that runs. You can see the sagebrush in the foreground. The Great Basin is a sequence of mountains with very long valleys in between. The valleys today are great for wind power. As you can see, this whole valley is covered with windmills. But these valleys can be 20 miles long and with fairly formidable desertous mountains. The difficulty of crossing the Great Basin was a major aspect of the pioneers going west. But we come back to the mystery. What's the mystery? All this water coming down into the Great Basin, where's it go? Geographers know that water always runs downhill. Well, except around Las Vegas, where it runs toward money, even if it's uphill. But anyway, the geographers said, there's got to be another way that the water gets to the Pacific Ocean. You know, we're on the western side of the Continental Divide, but they couldn't find it. It finally took John C. Fremont in a very major expedition that Kit Carson was part of to say, hey, wait a minute, there's no outlet. Some geographers actually invented a river. They called it the River Buenaventura, Rio Buenaventura, River of Good Luck. Well, good luck finding it because it wasn't there. So what happens to the water? The water sinks right into the ground in areas called sinks. It fills the Great Western Aquifer, an aquifer that had a lot to do with Western history, particularly in California. This is 40 miles between, this was taken at a little state park near the sink, near the town of Lovelock, Nevada. It's 40 miles straight west to Reno and the Sierras. No problem at all now. There's Interstate 80, you just zip along at about 90 miles an hour. However, for gold rushers who had to cross this area, it was very difficult because there is no water at all. And it's extremely alkaline. And they reached this area at the end or near the end of their long trek across country. It was very difficult. Okay, So we have the Great Basin and the sink. Let's go back on the other side of the Sierras and straight south into the Mojave. The Mojave is yet another desert and yet another ecological place. There's the Joshua Tree National Park. The national parks all over the place. They are oh so wonderful. The Joshua trees, you can see the picture, they're quite remarkable. I don't think there's any other place that they grow. And there are very impressive rock formations in parts of the Mojave. Mojave is another high desert. And this will conclude our trip. We're now in the southern part of California. So we have kind of crisscrossed the West to look at a variety of ecological areas, ecological systems, all of which affected the history. Well, we're now going to do something different since we've completed our trip. If there are any questions, this might be a good time to stop for a minute and I'd be glad to answer. Anybody have questions they put in the chat room?
You did have one. Let me get back to it. What Indian tribes were native to the West and which ones were transplants from elsewhere in the continental US? And how did these tribes get along with each other?
That is a very excellent and very complicated question. And it's exactly what we're going to talk about next. Okay.
And yes, this is the first class in the series. So
Yes, it is. So I won't talk about it now because I'm going to talk about it for the next 45 minutes. But before we can talk about the Indians, we have to do a little ecological history. The Great Plains was inhabited for tens of thousands of years. Archaeologists have found lots of evidence which they've divided into two different cultures, the Clovis, which is the earlier one, and Folsom cultures, generally based on the arrowheads that they found. They have found in mammoth skeletons embedded Clovis arrowheads. The early humans lived on these plains and hunted the great animals for tens of thousands of years. As I said, I think the oldest they found is maybe 15, 16,000 years ago. But about 5,000 BC, 7,000 years ago roughly, the climate changed. And it changed fairly drastically. Nothing new about climate change. It became much drier and colder. The early humans had to adapt, as well as the plants and the animals. The Clovis culture died out because the huge animals that previously lived on the plains died out. So plants, animals, and humans had to adapt. The plants adapted by having shorter grasses adapted to the higher, drier Western plains. The longer grasses could continue on the Eastern plains, but where we started on the West, the longer grasses could no longer grow. The grazing animals had to adapt then because what they ate changed. Buffalo, deer, and antelope became smaller and much more mobile. The smaller burrowing animals, the prairie dogs, if you've been on the prairie, you've probably seen at least evidence of the prairie dogs. They thrived, but not so much the grazing animals. How did they adapt? Well, the buffalo is a good example. The ancient buffalo was a huge beast, and they have many skeletons of these things, so they can reproduce this pretty accurately, the paleontologists and the archaeologists. quite different than the modern buffalo, which is a smaller animal. Although, let me tell you, when you're near these beasts, they look big enough. The smaller buffalo had to adapt and live on the shorter grasses in the western plains. But they had a problem. It's one thing to become a little smaller and be able to live on the shorter grasses. However, what do you do in the winter? Anybody been on in the winter on a winter storm in the Great Plains? Let me tell you, it's pretty formidable. Look at this little guy. He's cold and he's hungry. They had to do something in order to survive in the winter. Well, it turns out that there was something they could do. On the central and western plains, life was controlled by the weather and the seasonal pattern of the plants, animals, and terrain. Let's take a look at how that might be possible. Here's a different kind of map. Anytime you have to do ecological history, the first thing you need to look at is the plumbing. Plumbing is very important. The moisture coming off of the eastern slopes of the Front Range, basically in melting snowpack, flew into these large rivers that cross the plains from west to east. The very northern one is the Missouri, which is north of this map. And there's the Platte, which was terribly important for the Oregon and California Trail. By the way, it says South Platte there. That's the river that runs through Denver. The Kansas, Arkansas, Cimarron, Canadian River, and there's one more south of this map called the Red River. These rivers drain the Rocky Mountains. But it's not just these rivers. There are literally thousands of smaller tributaries that carry water generally into these rivers, and these rivers generally flow into the Missouri and then the Mississippi and down to the Gulf. It turns out that these tributaries and the bigger rivers were very important in how the buffalo and the humans could survive in the winter. Take a look. I took this picture from a plane. We were coming into Denver in January, I think. Look, nothing's growing, but look at the river. It's just one of the tributaries. It's not a major river, but there's green, right? Even in the middle of winter, things could grow in the river valleys. And that's where both the humans and the buffalo would congregate. Now that was quite convenient. The buffalo could eat the grasses that were growing in the river valley, and the Indians could eat the buffalo. So it was a way of surviving. In the spring, the grasses came back, and the buffalo would go out and scatter along the plains, and the Indians would follow them on foot, of course. Hard to hunt buffalo on foot, but that's how they managed to survive. Until a newcomer came to the Great Plains. Francisco Vasquez de Coronado. He was a conquistador. The Spanish soldiers who conquered the Aztecs stole their gold and set up shop on the Great Mexican plateau in Mexico City. Now, Francisco was thinking, there's a lot of gold up here with the Aztecs. surely there's gold in other places. He had heard of the Mayans and the Incas. Yeah, there's gold to the south. Maybe there's gold to the north. So he got together an enormous expedition. Hundreds of people, many more hundreds of horses, and enough to survive for a couple of years because he didn't know anything about what was in the north. He had to be prepared for everything. And off he went in 1540. Here's a map of the expedition. You can take a look in the south. He's coming up from the Mexican plateau up through the Sonoran Desert, which we visited, and straight up to about where the Acoma Pueblos live. Had a little side trip up to the Grand Canyon, which the Indians told him about. And then he had a little bit of a kerfuffle with the Acoma. The Acoma first welcomed them, but then got a little tired of how much food and everything this Spanish expedition needed, and kicked them out, actually. So Coronado headed east, straight east. He got to the Rio Grande Valley, and he stopped, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but about where Santa Fe is now, and established a camp, and he wintered there in 1540. Well, the Indians that were around there, I don't think they liked him too much, but he was too powerful for them to try to kick him out. And so what they did is they said, no, gold, yeah, there's cities, they're called Cibola. Why don't you go northeast? And you just keep going, yeah? And maybe you'll find them. And so he did. In 1541, he traveled east. It's the southern loop that he took, and then straight north into what is now Kansas. And he stopped right about the middle of Kansas, along the Kansas and the Arkansas River. Did he find his gold? Not a chance. He was looking for Aztecs on the plains in the 7 golden cities of Cibola. What he found was Quivira, a town of Caddoan-speaking people. We call them the Wichitas. They're related to the modern Pawnees, living mostly along the Arkansas River. No gold, no great cities, nothing like what the Aztecs had built on the Mexican plateau or what the Incas had built down in the Andes Mountains. So he turned around and said, this place is a bust. And the whole troop of them went back all the way to Mexico, where he told them, forget the northern part, there's nothing there. And indeed, the Spanish had nothing to do with the Great Plains ever again. They did, however, stay in the area around Santa Fe, but they didn't establish that colony for quite a while. So the Spanish left. Why was that important? Well, he left them what you might call 3 gifts. They didn't call them gifts, but they were terribly important. What were they? First, horses. Hardly anything more important. A lot of horses escaped from Coronado's expedition. And remember that pasture land? It was wonderful for them. And they multiplied and grew until by a couple of hundred years later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were millions spread around mostly the Great Plains and Texas. You can see from this map, it shows migration patterns of wild horses roughly in the 17th and 18th centuries. But guess what? The horses had the same problem as the buffalo. In the winter, they had to go to the river valleys. And there were the Indians. And Indians, some of them, not all of them, could tame the horses, learn to ride them, and became actually very, very adept. That was hugely important. The Indians that could ride, and they could ride well, for instance, this painting by Catlin of Comanche horsemen. Look at this guy holding onto a horse with one leg while the horse was galloping and was shooting a bow and arrow at the same time. Well, that may be a little fanciful, but there were some tribes that took to the horses very, very well, and it changed their life. For one thing, they were much more mobile and they could hunt the buffaloes much, much more efficiently. Just as important, or probably more important, is they gained a military advantage. The more sedentary tribes could not keep up with the Indians who were mobile. Okay, an important gift of Coronado to the Indians that improved the life of Indians who could live in the plains. The second gift was not so good. Disease, the European diseases. The Indians had absolutely no resistance to smallpox, measles, cholera, malaria, venereal disease. It absolutely devastated them. There was a huge epidemic in 1779 to 81, where archaeologists are guessing that maybe half of the Plains Indians died. There were other epidemics, 1801, 82, more documented by the Spanish mostly. Lewis and Clark, the first Americans who came into this area, reported totally deserted villages along the Missouri. In 1816, a reasonably well-documented epidemic killed something like 4,000 Comanches, half of the Pawnee Nation in the 1830s. Horses were still important. Mobile tribes like the Lakota and the Cheyenne fared much better because they were mobile and they were in smaller bands. And so they weren't stuck like the Pawnees, who were an agricultural group and sedentary. They didn't have the devastation of the diseases. So the power structure changed again. The tribes who took to the horses were already more powerful because of the horses, and they were less devastated by the diseases. But I said 3 gifts from Francisco. The third was also very important: guns. The Indians stole the guns. They saw how effective the Spanish were with them. And those Indians that could take to the guns and take to the horses absolutely changed the power structure of the Plains tribes. It also began a large-scale migration and intense warfare, because new groups that were actually woodlands Indians, like the Lakota and the Cheyenne, were being pushed onto the plains by other groups, including the Iroquois, who in turn had been pushed west, mostly by the whites. But being pushed on the plains was wonderful for them. Particularly the Lakota and the Comanches and the Cheyenne took to the horses and learned how to use the guns to great effect. They became the new power structure of the Great Plains. Other groups, more sedentary, the Arikara, the Mandans, Chippewas, Pawnees, most of these tribes were agricultural and did not have the same use for the horses as the mobile tribes like the Lakota and the Cheyenne, particularly, and Comanches. And so, first of all, they were harassed by the more powerful horse riding, gun toting tribes. And although they had lived in the plains for hundreds of years, they were pushed into niches along the Front Range and onto the eastern plains. But there was a catch. The tribes like the Lakota and the Cheyenne became increasingly dependent on whites because, after all, the only source of guns was the whites and the ammunition they needed to make the guns work. It so happened that just about this time, the fad of beaver pelts was waning in both the eastern US and in Europe, but buffalo skins were becoming more popular. And so the Indians could hunt the buffalo and trade them for guns and metal tools. The Indians actually devastated the buffalo herds. They killed many more buffaloes than, say, Buffalo Bill Cody, who was famous for killing buffaloes to provision the Transcontinental Railroad. That was later. But these tribes became quite dependent on the whites, and that had a big effect on their culture as well. Well, by the end of the 18th century, the Great Plains were in tremendous ferment, warfare everywhere. The horse riding, gun toting tribes like the Lakota, the Kiowas, the Comanches, the Cheyennes, they were fighting each other for predominance on the plains. And the more sedentary tribes were being pushed completely off. It was a time of great ferment on the plains. And when the whites came by the 19th century, they weren't sure what to make of this. And that kind of warfare became a way of life, raiding villages for food and for women. They would capture women and fold them into their tribe. Well, it was a difficult time. The Great Migrations. I mentioned the Lakota. These were Siouan-speaking people. There were many Lakota tribes, all speaking what became Sioux language, well, the whites known as the Sioux language. They were great horsemen. They pushed the Crows, the tribe called the Crows, who were agricultural, and in the northwestern plains, they pushed them west. The Cheyenne, also woodlands tribes from roughly where Minnesota is now, and the northern Mississippi, they came onto the plains, also great horsemen, and they pushed the Pawnees, the Cinnamon and Mandans, again, agricultural tribes that had lived on the plains for hundreds of years. They pushed them into niches on the eastern plains. The Comanche were farther south. Now, they actually did not come from the northern woodlands. Their traditional land was, in fact, in the southern western plains, but they took to the horse as well as the Lakota and the Cheyenne. And they pushed south and west, harassed the poor Pueblos who had built these magnificent structures, and the Navajo and the Hopi. The Navajo had actually been is a tribe that came from the north and settled in what is now Arizona. The Hopi are a Pueblo tribe that settled also where the Navajos were. 18th and early 19th century, a time of great ferment and constant warfare. New power structures, new territories. They were established by the time the Americans came onto the scene. Well, 1840, peace broke out among the Plains tribes. The Cheyenne, the Arapaho, Lakota, Comanches, Kiowas, Plains, all of these are horse tribes. They realized eventually that all this constant warfare wasn't getting them anywhere. And there was a big powwow along the Arkansas River, and they concluded an armistice. The older tribes, which had been pushed out, like the Pawnees, the Osage, Omahas, they continued to fight to try to hold on to some territory, but almost completely unsuccessfully. Well, it didn't last completely because particularly the Lakotas and the Cheyenne kept fighting over territory along the Black Hills. That's a beautiful area. And both of the tribes decided that this was sacred to them, even though they were never there during most of their history. And about the late 40s, 1840s, another change, big change, the California Gold Rush. In 1849 alone, something in the order of 30,000 whites trooped across the plains, mainly sticking to what became known as the California Trail, which went along the Platte River. Now, the Army saw that this huge number of whites were going to be there, and they established a series of forts, particularly along the Platte. One of them, Fort Laramie, which was actually established on the grounds of an old trading post from the Mountain Men. They said, look, we have got to stop this fighting between the Cheyenne and the Lakota because that endangers the large migration of whites. They got them together. And remember, 1840, they had already agreed to a kind of truce. At Fort Laramie, the Cheyenne agreed to stay south of the Platte. The Lakota agreed to stay north of the Platte. And both agreed to leave the great migration of whites unmolested. Actually, they would have been unmolested anywhere. When I was looking at stuff for the Gold Rush book, I had this picture of a Lakota warrior on a horseman looking at these tens of thousands of whites, all armed to the teeth, trotting along the California Trail. And I don't think they had any idea of trying to molest them, regardless of the Treaty of Fort Laramie. But still, the Treaty of Fort Laramie more or less formalized this pattern. Lakota to the north, Cheyenne to the south, whites in the middle along the California Trail. Well, we'll go into more of that history next week because the whites are there now. And so we can start the history of the Americans on the plains and farther west. But I thought it would be useful to take a slightly deeper dive into at least one of the tribes. The history that we've looked at so far is sort of from 30,000 feet. And I think it's necessary to know that. And it's basically interesting if you are interested in Indian history. But it becomes a little more meaningful if you can understand the history of particular tribes. I picked the Cheyenne, a very interesting tribe that was in the middle of everything, and unfortunately not always successful. They started. This map shows the migrations of the Cheyenne. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you start along the Mississippi River, they were woodland tribe, they were on foot. And around the late 17th century, they started to be harassed by Eastern Indians moving west into those woodlands. And they started on the move. Around 1700, they looked for other places in the eastern woodlands, were still harassed, and so they fled onto the Great Plains, the northern plains. As you can see there in 1725, and then they moved even farther west on the northern plains, across the Missouri, and then farther south. Because when they got to around the Missouri, they found another tribe, the Lakota, that had been pushed onto the plains, but had also taken very well to horses and guns. The Cheyenne were constantly fighting against the Lakota. Well, the Lakota generally were getting the upper hand. Pushed the Cheyenne south, but by going south, they discovered the Black Hills. Beautiful, beautiful area. And as I had mentioned previously, they decided that this area was sacred, and the Lakota decided the same thing. And so there were wars intensifying around the Black Hills. Unfortunately for the Cheyenne, the Lakota continued to get the upper hand. And the Cheyenne, by the turn of the 19th century, were forced even farther south into what is now western Nebraska. At this point, the tribe split. Some of them said, hey, look, this is no good continuing south. And they headed up north into essentially the Laramie Mountains, where they had other Indian problems, but they could hold their own. But the larger part of the tribe continued south. And they kept going south until they hit the Arkansas River in what is roughly southeastern Colorado. And they stuck there. The Lakota were no longer interested in following in pursuing them as far south as that. And then anyway, in 1840, they got together with the Lakota and the other warring tribes for their peace, their armistice. And so that's where they were around 1830. Two Cheyenne bands, one in the north and one in the south. Well, what happened? 19th century history continued to move along. 1856, the Army, the US Army, were coming into Colorado along with, guess what? More gold rushers. There was another gold rush in Colorado in roughly the 1850s. Whites poured in, and the Cheyenne tried to fight them off. This is somewhat successfully, The whites were no longer not as good the fighters as the Lakota, but the army decided they had to do something. They mounted an expedition under General Sumner and defeated the Cheyenne, who then agreed to stay in this area south of the Platte River, and which they had agreed anyway through the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and that's where they stayed. They didn't have a formal reservation. That came a bit later, but that's where they agreed. Within 5 years, guess what? The Civil War. The Civil War was not mostly fought in Colorado, but the Union Army was afraid that there would be Confederate incursions into Colorado. There was one almost successful incursion into New Mexico, fought off by none other than Kit Carson. The Cheyenne was now thinking, this is our chance. The whites are fighting each other. We can break out of this area that we agreed to stay in and raid the Colorado gold rushers. The gold rushers, and now the town of Denver, had told the army, you've got to do something. Right. These Indians are getting too difficult. Well, what was to be done? Black Kettle was the chief of the Cheyenne at that time. He had agreed to stay in this little corner of southeastern Colorado. Colonel Chivington was a Union officer and was put in charge of the Colorado Territory by Lincoln. He was fine. He managed to get Black Kettle to stop as much raiding as possible, but Black Kettle had another problem. Young people are always a problem, aren't they? Young teenagers and 20-something warriors kept on raiding. They weren't going to stay in this little corner of southeastern Colorado. They were called dog soldiers, and they formed raiding parties. And Colonel Chivington, as the Union Army commander, was put on a tremendous amount of pressure from the people in Colorado to subdue the Cheyenne. He formed a militia, not part of the regular army troops, but he asked for volunteers, and he got plenty. And he marched down to the main village of the Cheyenne. A lot of the Cheyenne warriors, including Black Kettle, were off hunting buffalo. Didn't bother Colonel Chivington. He raided the town at Sand Creek and killed pretty much everybody who was there. Women, children, old men, a few of the warriors who could not withstand him. It was indeed a massacre. It was a massacre with quite a lot of ramifications. For one thing, when Black Kettle came back to Sand Creek and saw what has happened, he advertised this among the various tribes on the plains, and they formed a coalition. It was the Lakota, of all things, along with the Cheyenne and the Comanches, and they started raiding more seriously on the plains. But there was another ramification. In the East, in the Congress of the United States, the word got out as to what happened at Sand Creek. And there was revulsion among particularly the Union population and in Congress. Chivington lost his army position, eventually left the army, became a farmer, never had anything more to do with the military. And Congress formed what was called a peace commission. The peace commission was supposed to travel to the West and negotiate with the various tribes to form reservations, places where the tribes could be safe from marauding whites, because they realized that this militia that Chivington had organized was not real military. The Indians had to be protected from the whites, and the whites had to feel secure that the Indians would stay in particular locations. And so reservations were formed. Black Kettle actually agreed, and the reservation was formed around Sand Creek, and that was the first Cheyenne reservation. But what happened? In 1868, after the war was over, the Cheyenne and the Dog Soldiers would not stay on the reservation. They broke out. They started raiding on the plains. The army, under General Custer, went to meet them, and there was a large and well-known battle on the Washita River. Black Kettle was killed, and the Cheyenne were defeated again. They retreated back to their reservation. They still could hold them, and later, in the 1870s, they made one last attempt to break out. And this time they went south, decided they weren't doing very well fighting on the plains. And so they went south, and there was what was called the Red River War. It was mostly in Texas. They were defeated again by, guess who? The Texas Rangers. The Texas Rangers was a great deal more than a police force. It was a paramilitary force, and they defeated the Cheyenne once and for all. These two warriors, by the way, on the picture, Spotted Wolf and Crazy Head, they were actually there at the Sand Creek massacre. They were two of the warriors that were away, so they survived it. But you can imagine the enmity that was created. They were instrumental in getting the Cheyenne to keep breaking out and raiding the whites. But unfortunately, there was no way that they could win the wars against the whites. They returned and stayed on the reservation. The army decided eventually to move them to what was called Indian country, basically the state of Oklahoma now, or the fat part of the state of Oklahoma, and established a new reservation along with the Arapaho, who were also Algonquin speaking. The Cheyenne language is an Algonquin language. And they were forced to stay with the Arapaho. Up in the north, another reservation was created. This is more or less in southern Montana. And so there were the northern Cheyenne and the southern Cheyenne, both of them well established. It wasn't a happy history on these reservations. There was no way that the Cheyenne could support themselves. They couldn't hunt buffalo. It wasn't big enough. In the north, a lot of the Cheyenne managed to get jobs in the Montana forests for the Forest Service, but they had many problems of poverty and violence, and along with other reservations in the upper plains like Pine Ridge, it wasn't a great life. But guess what? They survived. They're still there today. About 10,000 Cheyenne living on 2 reservations, one in Montana, one in Oklahoma. The Northern Cheyenne, in a city called Lame Deer, are thriving in the sense that they are surviving into the modern world. As I said, there are problems of violence and poverty, but they are surviving. They run their own police, they run their own schools, and an amazing number of them have kept the language. Something like 6,000 people speak the Cheyenne language as their primary language. They've also kept their horsemanship and they're proud of it. This is a picture, this is from a brochure, certainly I didn't take this. But they are very proud of their continuing horsemanship. Down in the south, the Southern Cheyenne Reservation was merged completely with the Arapaho. You can see right in the middle, Cheyenne and Arapaho. This was south of the Cherokee outlet, which was the result of the Trail of Tears. In the 1830s, the Cherokee were well established. The Cheyenne and the Arapaho came in and they were squeezed in between the Cherokee and the Kiowa and Comanche reservations. Well, they got along and they've gone into the modern age, surviving. This down at the bottom, Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, that's their symbol. And the Southern Cheyenne and the Arapaho elected a governor, a chief, Reggie Wasana. And he's an interesting guy if you look at his bio, graduate of the University of Oklahoma. And he led these tribes through the COVID-19 pandemic, which was very severe in most of the reservations. The picture on the bottom is kind of interesting. The Cheyenne and Arapaho War Memorial. Indians fought with the US in World War II very valiantly. Now, they weren't the code talkers, those were Navajo, but there were regiments of Indian troops fighting mostly in Europe. And they've now built a war memorial for the 2 tribes. Okay, we're about out of time, and that brings it up to date. Next week, the Americans, but we have a few minutes. Are there more questions?
Yes, there are.
Okay.
To what extent is the forced movement of Native American tribes west analogous to the forced movement of tribes westward to do pressure, oops, I moved too fast, to do pressure from the Asiatic Plains tribes during the last centuries of the Roman Empire?
Oh my. I'm sorry, I don't know much about the Asiatic migrations during the Roman Empire. Of course, the original humans that came into what is now the Western Hemisphere, there's evidence that they crossed over a land bridge, Bering Straits, and so there is Asiatic influence. Indeed, I think a lot of the physical anthropologists feel that Native Americans have an Asiatic background. But in terms of how that compares what the Romans did and what the white Americans did, I would guess it's similar, but I don't know.
Okay. It is my understanding that warfare among Indian tribes did not result in higher casualties as when fighting cavalry. Warriors often counted coups, showing bravery against their enemies to attempt them to admit defeat rather than having to kill them. Can you please comment?
Well, the fighting among the tribes on the Great Plains actually was very vicious. And you've probably heard the phrase scalping. That was fairly common. Now, whether or not, I don't think there were too many episodes like the Sand Creek Massacre of Indians against Indians, but there may have been. These wars on the plains, as far as the few whites observed them and wrote about it, and to a certain extent the Spanish, were apparently very vicious and were continuous. But I don't think there's any evidence about whether they were more vicious than the wars with the Americans. Certainly, there were some terrible incidents. The Sand Creek Massacre is not the only one by a long shot of atrocities committed by whites and particularly the army.
Is it known how language differences and inconsistencies played into the relationships between the colonist and the native tribes, or how certain tribes interacted with one another? How did this affect the conflict of the tribes being relocated by others, or how the different groups of colonists and tribes interacted, fought, traded with one another?
It's a very good question. I don't think there's a lot of evidence of how the different languages affected the relationships among the tribes. The languages are not mutually understandable. There's a huge difference between, for instance, the Siouan language of the Lakotas and the Arapaho and the Algonquin languages of the Cheyenne and Arapaho. They could not understand each other. But in terms of how the whites did it, during the phase of the mountain men, a very elaborate system of sign languages developed that was well understood by a variety of tribes and the whites. And these sign languages actually became fairly sophisticated and was a way of communicating. Of course, some whites learned various Indian languages, and of course, many Indians learned English. But I think probably the difference in languages was quite important in not being able to establish peace as easily as it did. But remember, the 1840 powwow, these were tribes of all different languages that got together and agreed on an armistice. So the language couldn't have been an insurmountable barrier.
Okay, next you have a whole thread on the devastation of the bison. Slaughter was supported by the government to control the Native Americans. Someone saying that they believe you'll cover this in a future lecture, and another 30 million bison killed in just a few years to control and starve out the natives.
I think indeed, particularly in the Northern Plains, that was a military tactic. But I think what most people don't realize is that the bison were killed by Indians, particularly in the early 19th century, in order to trade with the whites for guns. And there are many examples in literature of Indians slaughtering large numbers of buffalo and just skinning them They only wanted the skins and they would leave them on the plains. So it's certainly true that when the whites came, they devastated the buffalo, but it wasn't only the whites. And as far as killing buffalo as a military tactic, I have read some things about that. I'm sure it did happen, but I think there are many other explanations of the near extinction of the buffalo by the end of the 19th century. By the way, buffalo are coming back really strong. I've been up around Wyoming. I've done a fair amount of traveling around there. And particularly if you go farther north into Montana and North Dakota, there are a lot of buffalo. In North Dakota, I think there are considerably more buffalo than there are people.
Okay. Oh, come on. How exactly were tribal meetings and treaties conducted? These are Western and European concepts.
Well, I don't think it was only a Western concept. As I said, the 1840 powwow along the Arkansas River had no whites involved. This was before really the whites came in and became an important part of the power structure. In terms of how they were conducted when the whites are there, and there's more documentation, generally word would be sent out that there should be a meeting, like a powwow. And powwow, by the way, is not just a touristy affair. It is the way different Indians would get together, particularly Indians that were scattered of the same tribe would get together to perform their rituals and coalesce as a tribe. But for instance, there's a lot of information about the Fort Laramie meeting. I think it was a little bit fashioned in the way that the Mountain Men Rendezvous were put. What this was once a year, Indians and mountain men would gather at a particular place and they would trade pelts for guns and various other things. And this was almost a formalized set of meetings. There was no problem with them. The whites were generally in the middle and the various Indian groups camped around. And that's my image of the Fort Laramie meeting, that the whites were in the fort and there were Indians camped around and they would meet in the fort.
Okay. What factors differentiated tribes? Was it cultural, language, or religious beliefs, or something else?
Well, I think the answer to that is all of the above. The Indian tribes were cultures and were political units, maybe not quite in the cohesive way of whites thinking of political units, but they certainly existed. And the language differences and the various traditions of the tribes, the religions of different tribes, sounds like they had a similar base, all very much associated with nature, but then again, they lived in nature. But they were distinct units. One should not talk really about Indians. And in fact, in my travels, and particularly when I did the work with the Pueblos, the people that I talked to, when I asked, well, how do you identify yourself? It's completely identified with the tribe, not with the term Indians. That's a white term. And the concept of Indians being a race, that is completely a white idea. The Indians do not consider themselves a race. They consider themselves a member of a tribe. And even among, say, the Pueblos, there are about 12 or 15 tribes. I mentioned the Econo, that's one of them. And even today, they have their own towns and reservations along the Rio Grande River and then farther west. And they identify with their particular tribe of Pueblos. For instance, the Acoma. They would not say they're Pueblo, they would say they're Acoma. So really the tribe is the basic unit, and tribes distinguish themselves by language, culture, and history. So don't be fooled with the pan-Indian movement. It does exist, but that's a political creation of the 20th century. It's not the way most of the Indians, at least the ones that I have met, consider themselves.
Okay, the questions keep coming. I'm going to try to wrap most of these up. Given the current discussion about spiritual ownership by Indians of the Black Hills, could you expand on your comment about Cheyenne and the Black Hills?
Well, the Cheyenne was coming from the north, and they came across the Black Hills, which they then decided was sacred. Now, that's probably a term that whites used. What becomes sacred is slightly different in different religions. But the Cheyenne were not traditionally in the Black Hills at all. As I said, they previously had come from the woodlands along the upper Mississippi, and they had long migrations before they got to the Black Hills. But when they got to the Black Hills, they liked it there. And so did the Lakota. And that's why they fought several wars over that. Now, there was a later war, the Black Hills War, which was with whites. And that was mostly between the whites and the Lakota because there was gold discovered in that area. Gold is a recurring and very disastrous theme of Western history. But I'm not sure I can say much more than that.